the aesthetics of nature. In fact, the gap between artistic production and aesthetic appreciation, construed as disinterestedness, seems to be wider even than these remarks imply. The productions of artists have intentional meaning. They arise from deliberative purposes which common human understanding can grasp or fail to do so. How then could we take an attitude to them of human disinterestedness? It is for some such reason that there arose an alternative, slightly later 18th century conception, one that forged a connection between art and nature with the concept of the picturesque. As the term itself might be thought to imply, to construe the beauties of the natural world as picturesque and thereby make them available for aesthetic appreciation is to interpret them as pictures in the making. In other words, we can appreciate nature aesthetically insofar as we can view it as a series of pictures such as an artist might paint. Accordingly, landscapes are aesthetically appreciable in just the same way that pictures of landscapes are, in terms of harmony of colors, shapes, and perspective. The picturesque understanding of nature certainly forges a connection with art and the aesthetic. However, it seems by that very fact to eliminate the very thing that could be thought to constitute an appreciation of nature, its independence of human intervention and invention, which is what the concept of the sublime sought to secure. If a landscape is only aesthetically appreciable insofar as it has harmony, perspective, and so on, then it seems that these things are to be secured by deliberately bestowing them upon it, by painting them, or at a later date, capturing them photographically. The landscape painter and the photographer bring to the vista before us a perspective, a way of viewing it. The result is that, in the end, what is to be appreciated is not the natural landscape itself, but this painter's or photographer's way of looking at it. Alternatively, natural processes might themselves be used as artistic materials. The 18th century was the great era of an art form that has not been mentioned hitherto. Landscape gardening. One way to think of landscape gardening is as the creation of the picturesque in the ultimate unification of art and nature. Landscape gardening uses nature and natural properties as an artistic medium, by a means more intimately connected with the forces of nature than landscape painting. It imbues terrain and vegetation with intentional meaning. But it does not only by giving the natural order and a harmony that it does not have when left to its own devices. What results is not a piece of nature, but a painting composed of natural phenomena, streams, trees, grass, and so on. Even in a medium that uses the processes of nature itself, then, nature is not the ultimate object of aesthetic appreciation after all. In any case, this may not be the right way to think of landscape gardening, which has some claims to be regarded as a form of architecture rather than painting, or even a performing art, since its maintenance requires a constant gardener as well as the original landscaper. Landscape painting rose to considerable prominence in the late 18th and 19th centuries. It is notable that many of these artistic productions included human subjects, either human beings and their dwellings, especially castles, or objects of special interest in human pursuits. Landseer's The Stag at Bay, for instance. By the turn of the century, however, an alternative conception began to gather favor. This made much of the idea that the proper object of painting and photography was nature untouched by human intervention and interest. And a notable instance of art inspired by this conception is to be found in the work of the American naturalist John Muir. Muir's paintings aim not merely to represent nature, but to disclose it, and to do so precisely by excluding the deleterious impact of human activity upon the landscape. Does such disclosure result in the possibility of aesthetic appreciation? Even if it makes sense to suppose that we can abstract from the perspective chosen and provided by the artist, and thus infer that what is presented to us is, in some sense, the vista itself. Aesthetic appreciation seems to require more than merely savoring the beauty of the landscape depicted in a painting or captured in a photograph. We need to be able to explore and investigate its properties. This, after all, is just what we aim to do with works of art, and what gives substance to the idea of aesthetic judgment. But how are we to do this in the absence of intentional meaning or expressive properties bestowed upon it by the painter or the photographer? The most recent answer to this important question is that an appreciation of harmony, balance, and so on in nature is to be supplied by science, especially ecology. This is where environmental aesthetics comes into play. Environmentalism means many things, but in this context, we may take it to mean an understanding of the world in terms of interrelatedness or perhaps interdependence. The basic thrust of environmental philosophy lies in the claim that a proper understanding of the natural world, of which we are ourselves a part, must take account of ecology, the science which alerts us to the interconnectedness of seemingly independent features of the world. This is a theme with which the philosopher Alan Carlson is especially associated. The idea is this: in art, the backdrop that makes aesthetic appreciation possible is knowledge of the artist's intention, the history of painting, music, literature, and so on, as well as the conventional problems and devices with which artists work. In the case of nature, a comparable backdrop is to be found in our expanding scientific understanding of ecological interconnection. The landscape artist imposes harmony on the natural world. To appreciate and understand landscapes as such, we need to focus on their own harmony, and close attention to ecological relationships reveals just such a harmony. Aesthetic appreciation endeavors to discover an organic unity in humanly created works of art, and it can seek a similar ecological harmony in nature. Unlike the first, this second harmony derives from features independent of human action and intervention. But that is precisely how it should be. The aim, after all, is to lend to the aesthetic in nature an independence from the creative purposes of human beings. Now, there is nothing wrong, as it seems to me, with calling this appreciation of ecological relationships aesthetic. But we ought to be clear about just what this implies. It has long been remarked that there can be a kind of beauty about scientific theories, especially those whose universality is such that they bring a huge range of physical phenomena within the terms of a relatively simple law. Similarly, mathematical proofs can rightly be described as having beauty and elegance. Furthermore, this beauty is part of their attraction. It is what compels our attention and persuades us to continue to explore them even in the face of apparent snags and difficulties. Yet, we cannot seriously be in doubt that their significance lies not in their beauty, but in their scientific and mathematical power. This itself may prompt a sense of wonder by causing us to marvel at the astonishing sweep of understanding suddenly revealed to us. But the beauty and the wonder are essentially secondary. There is nothing wrong or even linguistically odd about referring to these as the aesthetic dimension of science or maths. Scientists often do talk about a beautiful theory. Where we do fall into error, however, is when we allow this linguistic usage to mislead us into thinking that it is beauty rather than truth that is of primary importance. A similar conclusion seems to apply to the ecologically informed appreciation of nature. What this uncovers is the remarkable interconnectedness of things, the striking equilibrium in which the great diversity of nature, land, water, climate, animal and plant life is held. 18th century deists had known of it, would have found here still more evidence of the wonderful contrivances of nature. But they could think of them as contrivances and in this sense works of art, primarily because they thought of them as supplying insights into the divine mind, the marvelous designs and purposes of God. If we abandon this theological context, as rightly or wrongly most modern thinkers do, and rest content with seeing them as ecological outcomes of evolution, then even if we stand in wonder, this is at most a byproduct of the scientific understanding we have achieved. On this account, consequently, the aesthetics of nature is an epiphenomenon. It does not enter directly into our understanding of and judgments about nature in the way that it plays a central role in our understanding of art. Those for whom there seems something wrong about an account which makes the aesthetics of nature peripheral or epiphenomenal to the scientific understanding which underwrites it, sometimes seek another alternative. They become nature mystics. That is to say, they believe that abandoning the Christian conception of God in His creation does not oblige us to abandon religious or spiritual values in toto. People also find sustenance in natural beauty. If contemporary materialist philosophers are reluctant to identify that sustenance as religious or spiritual, it is because they are too easily identify Christianity with all religion and reject the latter because of their problems with the former. Once spirituality is unhooked from its peculiar Western Christian version, by contrast, nature may appear as the repository of transcendent values. Kimmel and Gaskin, 1993. So, it may, I am inclined to say, indeed it is interesting that by means of a concern with the environment, the notion of the sublime should have re-entered contemporary philosophical aesthetics. Yet, I do not think that this appeal to transcendent values and spiritual sustenance can in the end serve to substantiate the idea of an aesthetics of nature. This is for much the same reason that the appeal to an ecological underpinning cannot do so. In both cases, the aesthetic becomes secondary. In the first, to science and knowledge. In the second, to spiritual or religious enlightenment. There is a parallel in the way music has often been thought to open up access to God. Music does open the door to the transcendental. This gives music additional value, but it does not explain its value as music. Similarly, though we may take spiritual inspiration from natural landscapes and vistas, this cannot be an adequate explanation of their value as a kind of art. Chapter 4 defended a cognitivist account of art, which emphasizes the ability of the artist to create images which illuminate our experience of the human condition and our understanding of human nature. What the discussion of the aesthetics of nature in this chapter shows is that nature itself, unsullied and unrefined, does not provide us with such images. In literature, painting, and photography, or more directly through landscape gardening, it can provide the materials out of which such images are fashioned, but only by the subjection of the world of nature to human intention and artistic purpose. In this sense, though the world of the natural may be beautiful, interesting, and inspiring, it cannot in and of itself, after the manner of poetry or music, supply something aesthetic to the mind. Summary. We began this chapter with a question. Can aesthetics be a matter of objective judgment? Or is it merely a matter of subjective feeling? Despite the general dominance of subjectivism in aesthetics, the common practices of art criticism and artistic competition run counter to it. Though further responses can be made to these difficulties, there is the constant risk that they collapse into a global subjectivism that says nothing about art and the aesthetics in particular and is self-undermining. An important counter to subjectivism lies in the observation that works of art are made. They do not simply spring into existence as objects freely available for unconstrained personal interpretation. Interesting and intelligible aesthetic judgments must take into account the point of view of the writer, composer, or painter, as well as the reader, audience, and spectator. Works of art are intentional creations, deploying the traditions, conventions, and resources of the practices which give them life and meaning. Perhaps, as the authors of The Intentional Fallacy claim, works of art are importantly independent of such factors. Literary criticism is not literary history. Nevertheless, they are objects with a meaning. And this implies that they are not entirely at the disposal of the free play of the imagination of those who choose to look at them. This implies that, while there can evidently be alternative, equally good readings and interpretations, it always makes sense to strive for a yet more intelligible, more comprehensive, more illuminating interpretation. This gives an objectivist view of aesthetic judgment an edge over the subjectivist account, which dominates so much contemporary thinking about the arts. This conclusion rests, of course, upon the contention that art has a meaning. What then of nature? Surely there can be aesthetic appreciation of the natural world in which, leaving theological conceptions aside, there is nothing intentional. Upon investigation, however, it proves difficult both to secure the independence of the natural and to forge a connection with aesthetic judgment as it applies in art. One way of doing so is to replace the intentional context from which works of art derive their intelligibility and depth with the scientific context that ecology supplies. In the end, though, this must make the aesthetics of nature secondary and derivative. We may wonder at the far-reaching and impressive balance of forces that nature exhibits, but it is scientific and not aesthetic judgment that reveals this to us. The themes of this chapter were prompted by the need to sustain the normative approach to aesthetics that this book has adopted by an examination and in the end a defense of the objectivity of aesthetic judgment. There is, however, yet one more question to be explored. Is this normative approach really preferable to the others on offer? This is the topic of our final chapter. It takes us into the realms of somewhat abstruse theory, and though it is logically crucial to the cogency of the book as a whole, the chapter is one that readers whose primary interest is in the arts may reasonably feel no need to grapple with.